some interesting information about her garden. She's been gardening, and Becky, you may be able to help me out here. What, 15, 20 years with native plants?
Uh,
So
15 with native plants.
okay, 15 with native plants. And she's done a lot of things. I think trial and error. Some have worked out fabulously well, and she might share some of those things that didn't also work out
All
well.
right.
So um, with that, Becky, if you want to go ahead and share screen and go ahead and tell us about your garden. And then
Oh,
after Becky does that, we'll go ahead and open it up to questions and answers for Becky. But then anything else anybody would like to share is also fair game. And then
okay.
we have a couple other people that have shared some photos that we'll also present. So go ahead
Before I
and
get started, hello. I want to apologize for any senior moments that may come up. My dogs decided that 3 a.m. was a good time to wake up, and I haven't recovered from that. So we will see what we will see. And also, I've been having some technological glitches, but we're going to get started here. Um, Now, is everyone seeing a whole picture except for me?
we
Because
are.
I've got a
Yeah.
bar in my way. Okay. This is the story of a person who used to grow lots of useless, pretty ornamental flowers. I started long ago in South Central Iowa, and then I moved almost my entire garden to Morningside area of Sioux City back in, oh, I think it was 1992, 93, something like that. And everything did fine still because I was in the bottom, in a little valley in the bottom of several hills, and I never felt any wind. It was always calm, and all my pointless, useless perennials did just fine. I had 50 rose bushes. I had delphiniums coming out my ears, and I was so happy with all this useless stuff. And then I moved again to Aurelia, which is in Cherokee County, and brought all my plants, put them in their new yard, and said, grow. And they said, we don't like it here. We had horrendous winds. We had ferocious climate temperature changes. I'm surrounded by windmills. My first year, we were just astonished. We went out and we got knocked flat. Things were blowing over. Arbors were sailing away. It was like, what have we done? For a few years, the flowers limped on. And as you can see, they look pretty nice, but it required more and more and more care, and eventually they just started dying. I remember I transplanted 18 full-grown delphinium plants and watched them all die, and I wrung my hands and I cried, and they all disappeared. I'm like, well, that's that. I can't grow anything here. I was sad. Then my yard, as you can see, was still mostly ornamentals, but things were not doing well. People used to stop and stare and come up and ask about my flowers. And after a while, it was just a bunch of dying weeds. And I was sad. Then one year, this is what I had to face. This is where the wind comes from. I faced due south. There are no more hedgerows. There used to be when we moved in about 16 years ago. They have gradually been eliminated, and the wind just comes roaring across the field, sometimes 60, 70 miles an hour. It blew shingles off our roof. That's how bad it is. So here I was in this climate I was not used to, and I had to figure out something else to do, but I didn't know what at the time. Then one year, I think it was about 2007, my husband and I went to the Seed Savers Exchange for a conference in Decorah, Iowa. This was in mid-July, maybe even late July. And after we went to the conference, which was lovely, we wandered around and discovered the Decorah Community Prairie. Now, I had never seen a prairie planting like this before, where they had planted in groups and swaths and swales and large clumps of the same flower with path winding through. So it had a much more ornamental effect. And we were just stunned. We just sat there. That was me a long time ago. My hairs don't look like that anymore. We took pictures. We wandered around. We couldn't believe our eyes. And it was an epiphany. So we came home and I got all excited thinking, well, you can make native plants look pretty. They don't have to look like weeds in the ditch. It just requires the same garden design principles to a certain extent that you applied to those fussy little invasives or imported ornamentals that serve no purpose. Next thing I did was read an absolutely eye-opening book that I had never heard of, stumbled upon it somehow, luckily, written by a woman back in 1993 who she herself in the 80s had bought a 5 acre property in New York that was sad and sick and things weren't doing well. Most of the native uh, wildlife inhabitants were gone. Things were unpleasant. She had weeds. Things were, she just didn't know what to do with it. And she started doing research after attending a seminal lecture by the same person that I started buying plants from, Neil Diebold, I don't know if I pronounced that right, who runs Prairie Nursery. And he changed her mind about how to deal with the property. You don't fight it, you bring it back to where it should be. And she wrote this long, wonderful essay. Basically, the book is an entire essay about the work she put in bringing native plants back to her property, encouraging pollinators and native wildlife. About the same time, there was a show on television on, I think it was on HGTV. It was about backyard habitats. I don't know if any of you ever watched that, but you could watch every week and they transform a backyard so it was habitat friendly. So I started paying attention to that and I sent away for my little sign and hung it up proudly on the front of the street and started thinking, what can I plant in my yard and where should I put it? First thing I noticed was the house we had bought back in 2003, which used to be an old farm, had a long driveway that shot out of the main lane, circled around our house, and sort of disappeared in the backyard somewhere, except when you're digging holes and you find all that gravel. It was really ugly. It was a side chute. It was not our main driveway. It was just there, heading right into the street. So I thought, well, that needs some plants. And I started researching and went to a few different catalogs, some of which turned out to be mistakes later on. One of them I was called High Country Gardens, and it was a wonderful catalog. I had been reading that author, the woman who ran the nursery, Lauren Springer, for quite a while. She lived in Colorado. So I started buying plants from her, but they were not always adaptable to Iowa. They were desert plants. Nevertheless, I put in a huge order. I also put in an order with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources to get their massive bundles of sticks, because that's all it looked like at the time, for wildlife plantings. And you get a bundle and it's got some choke cherries in it and it's got some lilac, which I don't know why they put that in there. And it has gray dogwood. They all look like little tiny twigs. So my husband and I got out and started digging hundreds of holes, putting things into the gravel driveway all over the place. Down near the street, we decided to concentrate on mostly flowers and grasses, and we put the trees and shrubs up on a different part of the driveway. And then we waited. We started a few more beds. This one, I got most of my plants for this. This was before Wild Ones was available here in our region. I had been going to their website and getting some ideas. This one, I got most of my plants from Prairie Nursery and from Prairie Moon. And I was buying those kits, build yourself a beautiful butterfly garden, which is fine with me because I didn't know exactly what I was doing. And it would come with the diagram. And so we put these little plunks in the ground and they didn't really look like anything. And meanwhile, the neighbors would drive up and down the street and look at our strange collection of small weeds and snicker. So I just tried to be patient and kept it watered when it needed and went and concentrated on the backyard where I felt more comfortable at the time, because these gardens were right on my street. They were in a drainage ditch that runs the entire length of the street, which never seems to fill up with any water. It's sort of the equivalent of what people in cities call the hell strip. And it was just horrible grass and it just sat there. So I thought, well, as long as they don't tell us to pull it up, we're going to plant it instead. So I went in the backyard, which I had already been trying to turn into an ornamental garden without any success as usual, and thought, well, I've got all these shady areas. I'm going to start buying spring ephemerals because I was more familiar with wildflowers, having spent so many years in eastern Iowa in the Iowa City area. And I didn't know much about prairie plants because this is the first time I felt like I'd really lived in a prairie region. So I looked around, thought, where can I work these plants in since I already had the beds, and I just started plunking them in. And lo and behold, wonderful things started happening. I was so surprised how well they transplanted. I got little tiny plugs and little dried bare root things off of eBay and from the catalogs. They didn't have much promise, and usually they would just come up very shyly at first, but stuff started to happen and it got really exciting. They had Dutchman's britches. In the other picture, there was a trillium. I had got several different kinds of ferns, and I noticed how beautiful they were in the spring before they even unfurled. And I realized that these things are not just do good plants. These are beautiful plants. And I started getting more and more excited and putting more and more in. As you can see in this picture, the wildflowers, quote unquote, and the native ferns are starting to take over what used to be more traditional plants of hostas and so forth. And the payoff began. That's Virginia bluebell. It's self-seeded now all over my backyard. I've got so much of it now. It makes me just delighted in early spring. They're usually about end of April. They're budding up right now. Some things I wasn't too pure about. Like this is a Solomon seal, but as you can see, it's variegated. I didn't really know the difference at the time, but I tried to stay in the same basic family, but occasionally I was buying hybrids and didn't realize what I was doing. Figured, well, they're still going to be better than some invasive ornamental from Japan or something. And geraniums. Maidenhair ferns were just lovely, and they have adapted really well here. I was surprised because I only seen them in the deep woods. I don't have that much shade in my backyard. It's just from an old dying ash and the shade from my house. But by keeping things moist, a lot of these ephemerals and woodland natives have taken off. As you can see, I've got the trilliums adapted well. Turned out ostrich fern, I hadn't realized that that was a native because it was everywhere in people's front yards. And then I did more research, and yes, it's not necessarily native that much to Western Iowa, but it certainly is to Eastern Iowa, and I was cutting myself some slack. So that went in too and started taking over the hostas, which wasn't bad because I had too many hostas and they were not native. I think that's a spring beauty, and it's started spreading around my yard too. Little clumps of things started growing so well I could transplant them. That's what I call marybells. I can't pronounce the Latin name for it. I've gotten 4 or 5 large clumps now from one little tiny transplant. Over on the other side of the screen is wild ginger, which is gradually spreading in the shade of a serviceberry tree. Another thing I made sure to do early on, because I had read somewhere someone said, always plant the trees and shrubs first, no matter how tempting it is, was to buy all the trees and shrubs I could get my hands on, but we didn't have any money to speak of, so they were little tiny whips, little things. My husband would laugh, these twigs would keep arriving, sometimes 2-3 feet tall, looked like something you'd rip off to cook marshmallows over the campfire. But, I had hope and they didn't cost much, so we'd plant them out and watch the rabbits eat them all up every winter. So we learned about making cages for all the little baby plants. And one year I remember we had to put out 125 rabbit cages to keep the rabbits from eating all the little tiny trees, but they did start to grow. The main trees and bushes I concentrated on after doing some research were serviceberries, native viburnums. I have an aspen, which isn't really quite native either, but I love it. It's not native to this area, but I love that. We planted chokeberries, choke cherries, gray dogwood. I have a red maple. Eventually, I even got an oak going, a red oak. We had some bur oaks, but they didn't take, so that was sad. But so we had the structure there, and it was slowly growing. And every year I go out and get excited because it survived. Eventually, some things became extremely happy in my yard to the point where they took over what had been formerly the ornamental beds and blended nicely. And that's what I discovered when I was planting and growing, was that you can use the native plants to augment and accessorize your more traditional perennial beds. Just weave them through. There's hardly any better filler than native columbine. And it grows in there amongst the tulips and just looks beautiful. That's bloodroot on the other side of the screen. Once the plant finds the right place, they know that they belong there. They're tough, they're durable, they can laugh at drought, they shake off insects, and they start to grow. This beautiful pagoda dogwood, which is sort of the pride of my back garden, was a little tiny twig. We weren't sure it was ever going to make it. And now, after about 12 years, it's just stunning. It's tall, it has beautiful horizontal branches covered with this lovely, lovely flowers every spring. And it's just a delight. And who needs an imported tree when you've got something this beautiful instead? So you can see that I started building an entire garden around that, with the focus being on the native ferns. I've got tiarellas and thalictrum and the wild ginger and so forth. And now I'm starting to put geraniums in there. So it's coming along really nicely. A lot of the native shrubs and trees, the flowers may not knock your socks off initially, but if you become acquainted with them and you're patient and rearrange your expectations, like these are not showy azaleas, these are not rhododendron, they're beautiful in their own way. The serviceberry on the left of the screen is one of the first things to bloom. It's covered with delicious berries every summer, and it turns a wonderful color in the fall. Over on the right is the nannyberry viburnum. No, that's my arrowwood viburnum, sorry. Also, it's just a sturdy plant. It's grown immensely without any care for me at all. I don't water it or anything. And it's always full of birds and nesting there, and it's covered in berries in the summer too. Here's another example of what can happen when you combine native plants with your traditional ornamentals, so you don't have to segregate them. I used to think, oh, I've got to have a native plant bed, and then I've got to have my ornamental bed because I can't give up on it, I can't quit it. But instead, they work together quite well. There are things in here that shouldn't be there if you're a purist. There's a Japanese fern, there are hostas, but the polyminium, the Jacob's ladder, is just weaving its way beautifully through the shade garden too. And I have native ferns, I have Joe Pyeweed slowly coming up in there, and the Marybells are down at the other end. And as you can see, the columbines have jumped over here too. They just love moving around the yard. Occasionally I made mistakes that I just live with because it's better than nothing. This was a hybridized Monarda. I at first didn't really know the difference between buying pure natives and hybridized versions, but it's still a Monarda, it's still a bee balm, and I feel like it's doing better than putting in something exotic that doesn't belong at all. And as you can see, it's working beautifully in a garden that usually has Asiatic lilies and delphiniums and all those fuzzy little plants. Then I went out front finally and started really paying attention because stuff was happening. It was so exciting when it finally stopped looking like twigs and little signs and weeds, and things started to grow. And I was just amazed. What else was surprising to me was how quickly native seeds found their way into my beds. Like, I did not plant that white penstemon. It just flew from the ditches, which I would see as I drove into town, and landed in my yard. And I was like, thank you very much, because now it's one of my better plants. Over on the right is Apache smoke or Apache plume. I can't quite remember the name of it. And it's been gradually, slowly spreading. It's one of the earliest ones to bloom in the spring too. So it started, what originally was my concession to the fact that I was failing to fight the climate, the microclimate where I lived, started becoming one of my favorite places. I'd sit out there, the grasses would sway, and the birds and butterflies would start to show up. And I didn't even really care that much about my fancy stuff anymore because I had this beautiful, easy to care for prairie instead. Now, certain plants did not like where we put them. We initially planted that entire driveway with both prairie flora and fauna. I mean, sorry, forbs and grasses, and flora and also put the trees in there. It has now become a thicket. So all our little things that we put out in that area, we had compass plant, we had baptisia, we had rattlesnake master and wild quinine. They've all been shaded out, but it's a thicket of useful things. It's got hazelnuts and gray dogwood and chokeberries, and birds love it. So you had to just give up on the fact that things do transition. That's how nature works. Eventually, I realized that part of the year my plants didn't look so good, even though they were just stunning to me. So I brought in some signs so the neighbors would stop gawking and shaking their heads and wondering what this crazy lady was doing, because I live in an area with very traditional landscaping. The informative signs started to help because people would actually stop and read them. This, as you may recall, the little section I showed you earlier, which was just little tiny plants in an empty square rectangle garden, this is what it looked like by the second year, starting to have some real promise here. And as you can see, I'm not picky. I occasionally sneak in some daylilies and so forth in order to have more interest, since these are right on the street and I don't want to get in trouble with the city for planting on their property. I try to make it look as attractive as possible. And this is what it looked like 3 years after I planted it. Suddenly it was just gangbusters. They take care of themselves. If you have the patience to wait, I'd say the first 2 years, by year number 3, you have yourself a beautiful pollinator garden. And things jump in that you weren't expecting. Things spread around the garden. They weave their way through the grasses and plant themselves in certain areas where they feel best. That hoary vervain, which is right down front next to the gaillardia, which is the red flower, was originally up in a different part of the garden. As you can see up in the upper left-hand corner, it doesn't like it there. It was too shady, so it moved down to the front, and now it's just doing beautifully. You have to let go of your sense of control. Too. You have to stop thinking, I've put this plant in a certain place and it has to stay there. You need to delight in the fact that nature is going to take a hand and things are going to move themselves about a bit. For example, the red flower, which is royal catchfly, was not planted by me. It just popped up one year to my extreme happiness because it's gorgeous, threw itself in amidst all the other flowers and said, well, we're staying. So that's great. And I started noticing too that there's really not much difference in the beauty of a native plant versus an ornamental imported flower if you just rearrange your preconceptions and your expectations. And look at that prairie clover, the purple prairie clover. It's just stunning. It's like a fireworks of purple. And how could you not love a plant like that? And yet it's a native plant. Eventually, as you can see, my flower plantings just grew and grew, and now they cover my yard all the way across the front with a little section that my husband wants bare so he can get the mower back and forth. And this is just perfect curb appeal, and they take care of themselves. Last year we had pretty droughty weather, and I think I hauled the sprinkler down there twice, and I didn't really even need to, but I felt sorry for them. And they just it's just stunning, and people stop now and they look at them and examine the flowers and read the signs, and I feel like this is doing a lot, not just to help the pollinators, but to help educate the public, because a lot of people just have never even considered the possibility that you do not have to fight against nature. You can go with it and still have beauty. So we just got some pictures of how pretty things were looking after a while. This was when I realized I had succeeded. I mean, this just stuns me that I could create this gorgeousness out of plants that were all happy to be here, that didn't require fertilizer. I didn't have to do awful things like use peat that I shouldn't be using because the peat bogs are being wiped out. I didn't have to use any of that, what we used to call laughingly the blue juice. There's no more blue juice, which is Miracle Grow, allowed in my life. And everything's organic now too. I don't use any herbicides. I don't use any pesticides. Obviously, I wouldn't want to do that because these plants are they're just alight with buzzing insects and butterflies, and all kinds of little bees, and they're all just so happy and busy, and you can hear it while you're sitting in the chair. That just hear the happiness of all the pollinators that have found a place to hang out. And oh, that's my mistake. I'm going to talk about some mistakes I made. You can see that red flower there. That was one of my mistakes. I'll get to that in a minute. You do have mistakes, and you have to just forgive yourself for them. Um, just some nice pictures showing you how beautiful the flowers are all by themselves without any interference from me. I think the gray-headed coneflowers, the yellow flowers over there have become some of my favorites because they really like to move around. And every spring I'm excited to wait and see where they've decided to put themselves this year. Have you ever looked closely at a spiderwort? They're stunning flowers. They're usually just hanging there, nodding their little heads, and you can't really see them. So I got down on the ground and started really trying to admire my plants from close up, which is no easy feat for a stout person like me. A little trouble getting back up, and notice that part of the problem is that you just have to get up close to these flowers and to really appreciate everything that's going on there. They don't shout like some imported flowers do. For example, look at these penstemons. Who could want anything else but that? They're just gorgeous. Now here we go. Here are some of the mistakes. I kept trying at first to force things in that I liked the looks of, as opposed to whether they were good for my little tiny ecosystem. This beautiful plant on the left is called a scutellaria, and it's really a desert plant. I kept buying it. It would bloom a year or two and it would die. And I was insisting that it be there because that's what I wanted in that spot. And it said no, and it kept dying. And finally, I wised up and planted that orange butterfly weed in the exact same spot, which has now come back every year reliably because it belongs there. Over here is a hybridized echinacea. All those beautiful colors. You go to the nursery and they have orange ones and they have yellow ones and they have red ones, and they're all weak. They're not strong. They're not sturdy. They've lost something in translation. And every time I'd put them in the garden, they'd look stunning for 1 year. They'd crowd out something that really ought to be there, and then they'd croak. So I kept trying for a while, and then I realized I'm just throwing money in the ground and I should stop fighting and trying to put fancy little foo-foos in places that they don't belong. Eventually, the critters showed up. The wildlife started to appear. This is a very blurry picture, I'm sorry, but there were 5 monarch caterpillars on my milkweed 1 year after it started growing. I was so excited. They ate it almost down to the ground, but they were doing their job and it was doing its job, and so I didn't mind. And we had swallowtails. And the birds started really coming into the yard once the shrubbery and trees got to a decent size. We had migrating warblers, all kinds of orioles. I had never in my life had rose-breasted grosbeak come into my yard, and now I have sometimes 2 nesting pairs at a time. And little baby robins in the trees. It's just been wonderful. We sit out in the month of May in particular when the birds are migrating is amazing. And we're a little oasis because we are completely surrounded by agriculture. The neighbor next door has many acres of land. They're all mowed and he sprays. The neighbor on the other side has many acres of land, all mowed or cultivated, and they spray. And across the street, you already saw what that looked like. So I think we are serving a small purpose too as a way station for a lot of this wildlife that ordinarily would have no place to go. Scarlet tanager, that was an exciting day. Another thing that I noticed, and I was pleased to see happening, was that most natives actually are beautiful in the fall too. They put on a good autumn show, so you don't need to think about, oh, I've got to get some burning bush or some showy plant that doesn't really belong here, so I have autumn color. Not at all. In fact, I find native plants put on a better autumn show than most imported non-natives in my experience. That's an aster that I bought through Les Hills Wild Ones, and it just was, after by the second year it was just a blanket of beautiful color. Grasses get all these interesting seed heads and blow in the breeze, and are just turn gorgeous colors of rusty oranges and russets and occasional warm browns. The bushes in particular, the service berries, the choke cherries, I'm not sure which is which here, but that's some of each, take on wonderful hues, and it's usually fairly varied too. They don't all just turn one solid color, but they have different variations. There are autumn blooming plants like the salvia, and of course the goldenrods, which all go crazy this time of year. I don't know if you can see in that picture, but that one little plant there is covered in bee type creatures. There were so many, it was just humming. When I was trying to take this picture, there was one on every single frond. They were so happy. Another thing people think you can't do is grow big, important, long-lived trees unless you go out and spend hundreds of dollars and have them trucked in with a backhoe and plopped in your yard. This oak tree, it's a red oak, is my pride and joy because when it arrived, it was about 2 feet tall and it looked like a twig. It's only about 10 years old now, and it's grown so much, and it's already hosting all sorts of various pollinators and wildlife. I don't know if you saw the program where they were talking about how many things go into how oaks are one of the best host plants you can have around here. And now I have an oak. Now I will not live to see it become majestic, but I certainly live long enough to see it serve a purpose. As you can see, just some more autumn color there. More asters, more of the shrubs, more of the little wildlife guys that are showing up. And even late in the fall, we get these interesting seed pods. The grasses still are a lovely color. There's all sorts of variation. I do not cut this down. I leave the signs up to let people know why my yard looks like a weedy mess at this point. And it tends to work. I was really pleased last year. All the city crews suddenly showed up on our street unannounced, and they were going to lay fiber optic cables. And it was like, oh, my worst nightmare. They have backhoes, they have crews, they're going to dig up the ditch. And they worked around my gardens without even being asked. They saw the signs, they went out of their way. And they told me later when I talked to them to avoid digging any holes in my gardens because the signs alerted them what the importance of what they had here. And it worked. It was wonderful because I've seen crews like that just obliterate people's yards and gardens. And they went out of their way to dig the holes in the grassy areas and stay out of the native plantings. And just a little bit more to show you how beautiful autumn can be with your native plants too. So you'll get a full year's worth of work out of this. You get the beautiful early spring flowers, berries all over the place. I sometimes stand out in the yard and eat service berries off the trees and the bushes at the same time as the robins, and they get irritated because they want them all. Then you have your high summer color. And even in fall, it's beautiful. In winter, I leave the grasses and the stalks up because the seed heads are still good for the birds, of course, and creatures are hiding in there during the winter. And it's about time now to finally go out and cut everything down. And I will be honest, that is the chore. You whack and whack and whack, but once it's done, and you virtually have to do nothing else. So I am so happy that I transitioned this way. I still have fussy things. I just ordered 2 English roses and some more delphiniums, but I have them in a back in their own little worthless bed where they still give me pleasure. But most of the time now, my energies are directed toward these native plants that offer so much joy for so little work. And I feel good about what I'm doing now. Instead of fighting and putting things into places and shoehorning things in where they don't belong, I'm working with nature now too. So I don't know how I rambled, but I'm done now.